the near future. But for today, we're very pleased to be meeting you virtually. And that's given us the opportunity to have a very large audience today of, I think, 271 last time I was told. So a very big audience for this lecture. And we're very pleased that you found time to talk to us today. I was looking at your CV and noticing that you've done a range of jobs in government. Everyone will know this. I'm new to Ireland, so I know it less than most. But I see that you've been involved in public expenditure reform, European affairs, transport, tourism and sport, and now you're the Minister for Finance. And I suspect you're in that post at a time when you're going to use your economics background to the full, because as we go into this post-COVID economic period and we seek to have recovery from it, and that's the topic for today, we're going to have skilled leaders to lead us through that. It's going to be a very difficult time, I suspect, but we're all looking at ways in which we can put the public finance back into good order whilst maintaining employment, innovation and growth. And it's a topic actually on my own research agenda as a lawyer, because I'm working with a group looking at the problems of dealing with over-indebtedness in the consumer field in this post-COVID period, which I think will impact on this as well. And I also know that there's bigger global issues as well about global taxation and digital taxation, which are going to figure in that, particularly in the Irish context. So I think I'm going to learn more than most today. I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation. I know you've got a tight schedule, so I'm going to move forward very quickly to let our president say a few words of introduction, and then we'll look forward to hearing your speech. But many, many thanks for taking time out today, and we do look forward to hearing you on many occasions on our campus in Galway.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Agus fáiltear Dara agus tá Browner in Equal to Chug Galing Latain Gaparsantach on fáiltear Gudi Galliv Gafirul. So you're very welcome, NUI Galway, and thank you very much for taking the time. And I think the topic of today is many challenges in front of you. So rest assured of our support, any support we can give you in that context. Because as a university, we've committed to being for the public good, and that sometimes that's taken for granted, but no harm in saying it at the same time. And I think many of the issues coming out of COVID, like a K-shaped recovery, the sense that there are a more limited number of economic advantages into the future, where taxation may not be as much an advantage, but education surely will, and the investment in that infrastructure. And finally, that sense that we need to reimagine our humanity following COVID, I think is something we're very supportive of. And in that context, I'll comment that we're very grateful to you for your humanity, because I think any time that you come across, we don't often see politicians only in the media and in other ways, but certainly your humanity comes through in how you address questions, think about issues. When you write book reviews, your sense of thoughtfulness and conceptual thinking brings you closer to what an academic life might be. And I think we're very grateful for that sense of reflection that you have, as well as the pragmatism of politics. So I think we're very grateful to you for that sense of reflection, that sense of humanity that always comes across, but also that sense of commitment to the public good, like ourselves. And we're very grateful to you today, therefore, for joining us. And I know that the students will be interested in hearing what you have to say. So stopi misha kaintanish, agus squilliam ben boher latain agus keen. So Gramila Magat agus beg fáiltear out an Galway Vainam. So you're very welcome to Galway anytime, and particularly in this day virtually. And thank you very much for the good work you're doing. Thank you.
Okay, I might start us off. So I suppose the first thing just to say is, again, to echo the Dean and the President in welcoming the Minister today. Apologies now if the background is not fake today, in the sense that, as you all know, it's a beautiful day here in Galway. And what we're going to try and do, just to basically flesh out what the way this is going to work today, is, so we've just got the Minister and myself on screen. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Minister's background, and maybe talk a little bit about his career to date. And then we're going to maybe split his period as Minister of Finance into pre and post COVID, because obviously that has changed lives fundamentally. And what we're going to do then is I'm going to maybe ask a few questions about how he envisages the recovery, but I really want to incentivize and encourage anybody who has a question for the Minister at that stage to put those questions across. I would imagine that a lot of the questions will probably cover similar themes. So what I'll do is I'll try and moderate the questions and ask them in a way that maybe synthesizes some of the questions rather than necessarily asking everyone. So again, if I ask a question that isn't verbatim, it's probably one that I've just put together from others. So I'll try and keep that in mind. So maybe we'll start. We were just discussing it there actually before the 2 o'clock kickoff, is that the minister actually has a background from his time in Trinity College Dublin in politics and economics. So maybe I might just ask him why he chose that degree in the first place, and does he have any regrets choosing to study economics?
Well, good afternoon, Cian, and to thank the President and the Dean for their very kind introduction. I just want to say I'm delighted to be able to participate in this seminar with you, and look forward to hearing the questions from everybody who's in the event. So where did I get the interest in economics from? I can vividly remember, Cian, where it all began when I was a student in St. Declan's CBS in the Neffin Road in Cabra. And my business studies teacher was John Caffrey, who was at that point also a player for Dublin for the Gaelic football team. And I remember getting into a discussion with Mr. Caffrey at that point regarding how banks operate. And I was asking him lots of questions regarding how is it banks are able to lend out more money than is put on deposit with them. And he began to explain to me the whole concept of fractional reserve banking. And even though at that time, I really only barely understood what he was explaining to me as a really young student, it did get me really, really interested in economics and how banks work. And that, combined with an interest in politics, led me more and more to wanting to study both of them together. So in truth, I'd probably say it wasn't the study of economics on its own that initially attracted me to doing it. It was the combination of the two of them together. And I loved my time in college studying the two of them together, but never really dreamed a few decades later, and it sends a shiver down my spine to use that word, a few decades. But I did not have a plan when I started off studying the two of them that I wanted to be the Minister for Finance, let alone a politician. Crossed many bridges before I got to that point.
Yeah. Just maybe before we get on to your career, just in terms of what you learned in economics in Trinity at that stage, is there anything that stands out to you from your studies that you think you've used over the years?
Absolutely. I mean, there are many things that I learned from my time studying economics as an undergraduate student that have carried with me into my time as a politician and as a policymaker. What I've learned that has stood the test of time is the value of an appreciation of history in economics, is a value of the appreciation of uncertainty and policy making in a dynamic environment of incomplete information where time really matters. And a lot of the study of economics at that point has really influenced what it's like then to be in that environment. Monetary economics, particularly the foundations of a common currency zone and what that means for practical policy choices, again, has proved to be great value in later in life. In truth, to answer your question, Cian, honestly and open, I've also learned that a lot of things that I studied in economics at that point, the study of the economics in the mid-1990s, a lot of it, much of it has also not stood the test of time. If I think of how much time I spent studying the efficient market hypothesis, the spread of information in financial markets, to say that has not stood the test of time would be an understatement. And also economics that I studied then really didn't have an understanding of the constraints that policymakers face, and really didn't have an appreciation as well of a time of the role of politics in economic policy decisions being made. And at times was pretty good on the macro, but pretty lacking on the micro. So, but this is the reason why I loved studying economics, and it's the reason why I'd encourage everybody to do it, because it's a social science, and it's always dynamic and always changing, and that's why it was such an exciting thing to study, and I'd love to return to the study of it again.
Okay, but interesting enough, when you left college, you didn't say take the route of going into a grad program with, say, the Department of Finance or Central Bank or something like that, which might be considered a normal thing for somebody graduating in economics, but instead you went into the world of business with Procter & Gamble. So I won't dwell too long on that, but I suppose my question would be, in terms of what you learned in Procter & Gamble, this might be a two-parter, what do you think that you've learned from your period there? And then the second part of it, why did you decide to leave what would have been considered obviously a very good job as commercial director of P&G to enter, I would say, the uncertain world of politics? Like what brought you back to do that?
So to answer the first part of the question, I had a sense as I worked my way through undergraduate life that as much as I loved the study of economics and politics, I had a sense of the need to acquire new skills and a more rounded education. And what Procter & Gamble did as a very large employer is it offered a further training and skills environment that was really demanding, but of a very, very high caliber. And I went right from studying economics and politics in Trinity and completing my degree to selling truckloads of Pampers and Dad's washing powder to cash and carries in East London and Birmingham. And I remember vividly, day one I started in P&G, which was a world-class training environment and a company that to this day, I have nothing but the greatest of things to say about. But they literally started me off. I got the keys of a Vauxhall Cavalier, a boot full of Pampers Sunny Delight, and not Sunny Delight at that point, that came later, and washing up powder. And I had to go and sell it. And it was a brilliant continuation of what I was learning, and fantastic fun. But then that many bridges later, why I left Procter & Gamble is I do have a real, being a public servant is something that's really important to me. I am a public servant. And as I got a little older, I just realized that's something that I really wanted to do. And I love the cut and thrust of politics. I love the ups and downs of it and the arena. And I began to get more and more interested in that as I moved through my 20s. And I got to the point, Cian, that I said, if I don't give this a go, it's never going to happen. So I resigned from my job to contest the general election, and I lost the election. And my time in politics began from there.
Okay, so eventually things did move up for you, and as the Dean indicated, you've had a number of portfolios, including Minister in European Affairs, Transport, and then Public Expenditure, and then culminating in Finance. In, I think it's 2017 you started. So, as I said at the start, we might just take the period from 2017 up to, say, around February, March last year as being a quote-unquote a normal time for economics and financial markets. So maybe if we cast our mind back over that 3-year period, though, what were the main takeaways or things you learned maybe from your first stint in the portfolio?
So there'll be a number of different strands to us. Across that period, being Minister for Finance, and as I was then a Minister for Public Expenditure, the policy challenges, it was all about trying to move to a sense of policy balance. Because in the holder of those portfolios, which I now share with my very close colleague, Minister McGrath, it is all about trying to get the balance right between the constraints of today and the constraints of tomorrow, I should say, and the needs of today. So every day you wake up with the pressures being there for more to be spent, for taxes to be reduced, for needs to be met immediately, and getting the trade-off between the constraints of tomorrow, which are going to develop and they're always there. And the unique challenge of that period is I was trying to do that role in an environment of what was then the political period that was the aftermath of the post-crisis period, in which the level of demand, and when I say demand, I don't mean that pejoratively, because that demand had very many legitimate needs that were behind us, where we were with housing, where we were with public pay, where we were with living standards in the post-crisis period. It was trying to reconcile that then with the constraints that I knew were there and I also felt would re-emerge in the future. And then the political strands behind that then had a number of different layers. The first one is being in a minority government, and not something you'll read about often in an economics textbook, but something you'll read about a lot in a politics textbook. The second one was Brexit, which consumed so much capacity across that time. And then, as always then, which is vital, being a finance minister in an open economy, my Eurogroup ECOFIN responsibilities, and then the change in the transatlantic relationship with President Trump taking office in 2016. And it was all about trying to get to an adjudication between all of those competing prerogatives and trying to present to the public then the need for that balance, and also trying to create that balance within government as well. And they were the defining features of the pre-pandemic era, which consumed a huge amount of my time, and I was so privileged to do it.
Yeah, of course, looking back now, we were all enthralled with all the votes in the House of Commons and you know, the nail-biting votes around and that. And of course, looking back, they do pale into insignificance considering what's obviously probably happened over the last year. So just in terms then, I'm trying to bring it up to the, I suppose, March 2020 as the pandemic hit. And of course, we all remember when the Taoiseach announced, I suppose, the first lockdown. And those of us in academia suddenly had to transition from teaching in a normal environment to teaching this way. And for the students present, it was obviously a massive challenge as well to learn in a different environment. But from your own perspective, in terms of crisis management, what were the first, say, couple of weeks like, and what do you remember about the first few weeks of the pandemic last year?
So the first thing I'd like to say is just recognize what all of this has meant for your students, particularly for younger students who are starting off their campus. You know, your university is you know, such a fine place of learning, and also such a fine place. And I'm so conscious of how much challenge it has been for so many of your students, and how much they feel they have lost, and they have lost. And we are, you know, have to redouble our efforts to make sure that all of your students get the campus and the learning experience that you want them to have, Cian, and all of the academic community want them to have, and I certainly want them to have. So just to say that before I get on to answering your question. Yeah, I mean, that period there from March to April was, you know, intensely demanding. And when I talk about the demands on us, I also want to say what a privilege it was to be there, and how I will, you know, always, despite the many demands that I'll touch on in a moment, will always be so grateful to the people of Dublin Central and to the people of Ireland that I had the opportunity to be there for a period of time. And of course, I've been there now since the pandemic hit Ireland. I've been a member of the COVID Cabinet Subcommittee, along with the now Taoiseach, since the very beginning. So I've seen the full swing of everything for this terrible disease and the effect it had. But to go back to what it was like a year ago, it's difficult to do justice to the atmosphere of uncertainty that we were in. If I talk about it socially and politically on behalf of our country, the concern that we had regarding how many people could die and what that could mean for our country, and the planning that we were doing and had to do so quickly to do all we can to minimize the loss of life. But the very early meetings that we had in the Sycamore Room and then in Cabinet, and bear in mind, we're in the immediate aftermath of a difficult general election. We're as difficult moments as you can get in politics, because the most fundamental duty any government has is to the safety, life and well-being of its people. And suddenly we were facing into a scenario of this disease developing in China, where China and their government and their people experienced the whirlwind of this death. And then those terrible moments, which I will never forget, where it began to develop in Italy, then move into the United Kingdom, and what that meant for our health and planning and for our health system. And then economically, I mean, I am sitting here to you in the meeting room at the Department of Finance. It's beside my office. I remember those moments where my officials came into me and said, we believe we will have many hundreds of thousands of people unemployed next week. They will be unemployed because we will be asking their employers to close. And we need to think about how, from a system point of view, we will be ready to cope with that. And we also need to think about the obligations we have to those people who are losing their job because we as a state are asking their employers to close. And then the massive challenge that ran alongside that of the battle for how many employers we could keep open and keep them going. And that led to these really intense weeks and months where we were coming up with the employment wage subsidy scheme, the pandemic unemployment payment. And then we were having, an all-night meeting in Eurogroup and many meetings within Eurogroup and ECOFIN about what was the right policy response within Europe to this pandemic. And those few weeks, and then the weeks in the end of November into December and up to early February were the most testing period in helping our country and trying to lead our country through this great challenge.
So just mentioned there about the Eurogroup and ECOFIN, maybe for those students not too familiar with the operations of how that works, I mean, again, there's a lot of discussion as to how well, say, the European Commission has handled the acquisition and subsequent rollout of vaccines. But from the point of view of on the financial side, how would you see that the Eurogroup and ECOFIN has operated as president of the Eurogroup? What role do you play in setting the agenda for this? And maybe, as I said, just for the students, just maybe flesh out a little bit about why it's important that they understand the role of the Eurogroup as well. Sure.
Well, maybe to take a step back and explain what they are. So ECOFIN is basically all of the finance ministers within the European Union. It's a kind of semi-formal institution, and it meets once a month, at least once a month. And then Eurogroup is the finance ministers who share the euro. So that's basically the difference between the two of them. As president of the Eurogroup, I was elected by my colleagues there last summer, to ask, what is my role? Well, I determined the work program of the Eurogroup with all my colleagues, and then which leads to political and policy output every month, which, from a Eurogroup point of view, is about the challenges of budgetary coordination within the euro area. What is the right fiscal stance for the euro area? And then from a monetary point of view is about banking union, progress on banking union, and then so many other monetary issues, such as, for example, the digital future of the euro, the international role of the euro. And then what I do then, along with the president of the Central Bank of Europe, President Christine Lagarde, is President Lagarde and I then, around every 10 to 12 weeks, we make a presentation to the heads of government of the European Union about our work and the progress that we're making. So that's very roughly what it is. And in terms of the case that I would make to you regarding how Europe has responded economically to this, I mean, I would make the case respectfully to your students that the European Union on the economic criteria has performed and responded back really strongly to this pandemic hitting. So over the space of a few weeks, we completely changed our policy stance to run a really significant expansionary policy within the euro area that was completely integrated into the monetary policy of our central bank, the ECB, and the Central Bank of Ireland. So, for example, last year, the discretionary fiscal measures of the euro area was around 8% of euro area GDP. And if you look at what that means in real life, just to give two really tangible examples, unemployment in the euro area went up by 0.5%, despite the shock that we faced. And for example, if I look at the SURE program, which is a program rolled out by our Commission that basically co-funds the wage subsidy schemes of the European Union, that has been responsible for funding the wages between 25 to, I think, 30 million citizens of the European Union. And then we deepened the safety nets of the of the euro area through developing the role of the European Stability Mechanism, and then through the work in the background of the ECB, which played a critical role in creating an atmosphere of stability when these massive choices were being made. So I would say, if you look at where we are now versus where we were a decade ago, profoundly different response. But I would make the case to you, Cian, and to your students that by many different measurements, economically, the euro area and the EU responded swiftly economically and critically, which is the ultimate test of economic integration, responded far more comprehensively and credibly than member states or countries could have done if they had done so individually. Yeah. That's the case I'd make.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether or not some of the students have been watching the Really in the Years for 2010 and 2011, which for us, of course, was, it doesn't seem that long ago that it happened, but of course it is.
And it's my defining period. I mean, yeah. My defining experience as a politician is getting elected in the global financial crisis, yeah. And then right up to the pandemic being defined by the aftermath of it. But I guess my defining experience will be something new now, which of course will be the pandemic.
Yeah. But just on that point, I suppose that, as you said there, a decade ago, the orthodoxy was again around austerity, or if you want to call it that, or at least fiscal prudence, maybe from the Germans and others in the core part of the euro area. Whereas now there's a different, I suppose, understanding of maybe how to get out of the crisis. So just that might be a nice way to pivot to that issue, which obviously is what we want to maybe focus in the second part of today's class. And there's some questions coming in, which I'll get to in a minute. And thanks for everybody for sending in the questions. But maybe I might start actually with one I see there is coming in a few times, and it's something. And people have been asking, I think, in relation to the Financial Times article that was published yesterday as well, about the debate around the global minimum tax, and I suppose the new Biden administration's idea around that. And I suppose for our perspective, obviously corporation tax receipts in the last number of years have been particularly important, obviously, as part of our tax base. So how do you envisage, I suppose, charting a course in terms of finding an optimal tax rate over the next 2 to 3 years? And is that going to be a challenge just for yourself, or it's obviously going to be much broader at an OECD and possibly global level?
Sure. So, and maybe we'll touch on this in a moment. I think also when we compare where we are now versus where we were to 08, 11, it's not just the policy framework that's changed, it's also the fact that they're profoundly different economic events and crises that we're now responding back to. Maybe we can go back to that. Yes, indeed, just to deal with the issue there of corporate tax policy. And I made a speech and an intervention on this subject there yesterday that has garnered a fair bit of kind of attention and profile now from many different stakeholders and policymakers. The The background to the corporate tax debate, both globally and in Europe, has profoundly changed. And it's changed because of the deficit, the pandemic, and the cost of the pandemic, and the need to rebuild national finances over time. And it's also changed because of a tone of equity, in that many very large companies have economically fared well across this period. And the understandable question is emerging from citizens regarding how those gains should be taxed, given the economic and living standard consequences of the disease. And the proposals from President Biden have undoubtedly further charged and accelerated that debate. And it's a very profound and very important policy area for Ireland. And there is absolutely change coming. I've been saying this now since 2017 to 2018. I was arguing that point for why we needed to move into a surplus. And if we hadn't had to deal with this pandemic, as is the case with so many other things, we would now be in the middle of 2021 with a reasonably large surplus having developed. But what we'll have to do now is continue to engage with this. It'll be happening at a global level through an organization called the OECD. So I'm, of course, engaged in a lot of contact with finance ministers within the European Union and with America in relation to this. And what I'm going to be trying to do is trying to work with many colleagues across the world that finds a landing zone for this, that also works for small and medium-sized economies. Because it's not just large economies that want to maximize their tax revenue and want to be competitive. It's also something that small and medium-sized economies want to do as well. And within that, I strongly believe that there is a role for legitimate tax competition. And if small economies aren't willing to make the case for that, then we could indeed end up with a framework that works well for some, but not for all. And within that, I acknowledge that there will be a loss of corporate tax revenue for Ireland. I think that's really, really likely. But if that's the case, there are also ways in which we can move forward in this debate that recognises the value of innovation in our tax code, recognises investment, but still allows a degree of legitimate tax competition for economies that don't have the benefits of scale and location. And they're the areas which I think we're going to be consumed by in 2021.
I'm just going to take a number of questions together. And just when you talk there about innovation, one of the things I also spotted in the last few days is a discussion, I think another speech you made around innovation in financial services, and in particular, possibly in the area of, it has different names, sustainable finance, ESG, green finance, and so on. And I suppose a number of the students have brought up issues around climate change and the climate action plan, and how maybe green financing will play a role. So just in terms of bringing all that together as a package, how, first of all, important do you think climate change will have an impact on finance? And then secondly, does Ireland have an opportunity here to get ahead of the curve, and possibly, I've seen a discussion maybe that Ireland could become maybe a European centre for green finance and sustainable investing?
So even in the now nearly 4 years that I've been a finance minister, the way to which climate change has elevated to now being a core mainstream agenda item for finance ministers is amazing. So when I began this role, at that point, climate change was an issue that was engaged in and discussed as an important topic, but not a core topic. It's now a core topic. It's a regular agenda item in ECOFIN when we meet every month. And I have the privilege of being a member of the G7 Finance Minister Group as president of the Eurogroup, which is the largest economies in the world and their finance ministers, with the exception of China. And we meet every month. And climate change is now discussed every month in those meetings. And in terms of, for example, how it impacts on my work as Finance Minister for Ireland, I'll give you two really practical examples. So, for example, as Finance Minister here, I've now legislated that for every year, for every budget I do, the price of carbon will go up through additional taxation be levied upon it. And we've done it for the last 2 budgets, and it'll automatically happen for the next 6 until we get to our target of €100 per tonne of carbon. And then the whole area then of green bonds, the taxonomy of financial products, is growing by the day. So at the moment, 38% of every green bond that is issued is euro denominated. We've done significant green bond offerings in Ireland. If you look at it from a taxonomy point of view, and it's amazing to look at this. So the Financial Times on Monday had an editorial about taxonomy standards for sustainable finance. And it's sometimes the case with the most important things, the language for it is appalling. I mean, what in the name of God is taxonomy? But actually what it is explaining to investors what are the climate consequences of different investment choices that are made. And in order to do this effectively, it has to be done with scale. So that's why the European Union is taking the lead in it. And it's been done by an Irish commissioner, by Mairead McGuinness. And it's going to be a really big deal. So I really think there is an opportunity for Ireland to accelerate our standing in this world, and we're looking to do it. But I think it's also fair to say that we need to make credible progress with the implementation of our own climate action plan to be able to have a kind of a good foundation off which we then talk about those things. And that's something that Minister Eamon Ryan is doing, who I work really closely with. And yeah, it's a really big area of challenge for Ireland, really big area. I mean, when I implemented the change in carbon pricing, every opposition politician voted against it. When I changed our taxation regime for motor vehicles, and when I changed the taxation regime to recognise more energy efficient motors and engines, virtually every opposition politician voted against it. But these are the areas we have to tackle and change.
Yeah. Just, and I said I'll take a couple of questions together again. There's a number of questions around the banking sector, because again, some of the students here were studying banking and markets and so on. So in terms, obviously, as we know, a few companies like KBC have announced that they're going to exit the market. In terms of that, the impact of that on the general banking sector in Ireland, and perhaps on the future of interest rates, mortgage rates, etc. Do you have any sense that Ireland will need to do something different to try to reform? Because you mentioned a while ago about banking union in the context of the Eurogroup as well. How do you see that the future of banking in Ireland, and maybe as part of a wider I suppose change, I suppose, in banking brought about by the likes of fintechs and other neobanks as well?
Yeah, so I mean, we've had a number of really big setbacks on this over the last number of months now, with the exit from Ireland of international banks who can basically earn a far higher level of return in other small markets or bigger markets than they're able to earn here in Ireland. And the causes of that is probably, would be the subject of an entirely separate seminar with much debate within it. But we are going to have to take stock now of where we stand and begin to think about, what is the future of our banking sector and what's the policy framework of it. And with any policy framework, it's going to have to begin with a better alignment and appreciation with the reality of where we are today. The reality is that if you look at the fintech environment, we have, and I'm not going to start naming companies because it's not my role to single out individual companies to give them particular profile. But we have international financial services companies that are based here in Ireland that do not have a branch, that employ very few people, that are used by huge swathes of our population for their banking services. And so many of our citizens now think of banking not as something they do in a branch, but as something they do over their phone. And any And that is why when we think about what the competitive dynamic for Irish banking is going to be in the future, it could well be the case that the new competitive dynamic is provided by financial services providers that have less of a physical presence here in Ireland, but a huge footprint, but that's done through technology. And then we have our larger Irish-owned banks here that are providing a far broader variety of services than, in inverted commas, just a core retail banking service that we know well. And you've seen big developments in each of our 3 Irish banks with regard to that now over the last few months.
Again, a few questions have come in there around the fiscal policy, maybe for the next couple of years. Again, I would really encourage any students to read the SPU that was published in the last couple of weeks, and the presentation that accompanied that. It's very interesting actually to see the projections for this year and the next couple of years.
And I should say, Cian, the department here and my officials go to great lengths to try and present that information in a way that is accessible.
No, I must compliment. I'd have to compliment them. It's really excellent, actually, in terms of
huge work goes into this, not just into the policy content, which is still the most important thing, but trying to present it in a way that is really accessible. And we, even use so many different social media formats now to be able to explain to those who are interested what are the kind of key points in what we're doing.
So a question, I might combine a couple of things. So there's questions around the future supports for the SME sector in Ireland, but also maybe more broadly at a fiscal policy level. Do you envisage continuing to give a lot of supports for various sectors that have been hit particularly badly by the pandemic? And maybe at a broader level then, in terms of, say, Irish fiscal policy linking into European fiscal policy, can we expect more in the way of fiscal stimulus over the next while? So I suppose all put together in terms of maybe giving people a sense of what we can expect for the next 12 to 18 months in fiscal.
Well, it's a kind of very timely question, because as I mentioned to you there before we began the event, one of the reasons why I have to finish up shortly is I have to go into the Dáil to pass the motion and have a debate on the extension of our fiscal supports until later in the year. To answer your question on fiscal supports then, and maybe I'll do it in a way that kind of, I hope, brings to life the integration between what a small open economy like Ireland has to do and the anchor of where we are in the European Union and in the Euro area. Because to begin with an answer to your question, the Eurogroup agreed a statement on this matter in March, which was integrated into a Commission communique on this matter, where we indicated the need for a supportive budgetary stance for the European economy for 2021 and for 2022, that had followed on from a Governing Council meeting of the ECB that had happened a week before that. So the broad environment is one of the need for continued support in our economy throughout this year and into next year. And so the question then becomes, what will the level of that support be and what will be the form of that support? And from where we are at the moment, where we still have so much of our economy shut down, but thankfully we're beginning the process of slowly reopening it, we do at this point begin to talk about what are the general levels of support that are in place. And the general level of support that is in place at the moment is one that we are now debating within government. Should that be continued? How will it be continued? And what we've really, I hope, clearly said to business owners and managers is there will not be a cliff edge, that the supports that we have will not go to nil suddenly, imminently. And then at the right point, Cian, we'll have to then get the phasing right between how we move from general levels of support into sectoral specific support programs and how that will be mapped out and how we will do it. Before then beginning to the really thorny issue of when the health emergency lifts, how we manage or move away from emergency expenditure measures as well. Because that's the key challenge of our national finances for the next few years. As the SPU indicated, that's the Stability Programme update. if we can get the timing of this policy choice right, which is reducing emergency expenditure and emergency tax measures as the health emergency begins to ebb and then we defeat it. Actually, the prospects for our national finances are positive because we went into this pandemic crisis with a very low level of macroeconomic imbalances within our economy, unlike what happened a decade ago, which actually means the ability of our economy to move back to balance is positive. And that's the big fiscal policy challenge, which is something like, to bring it all to life, before I met you, before I came in here, I had a meeting with the Secretary General of the Department of Finance, the Chief Economist of the Department of Finance, and then the Head of Finance for the Department of Finance, all on this topic, looking at what are the different scenarios and what are the different policies we need to consider. And I've been meeting them, this is a standing item that we engage in virtually every day.
Yeah, I think it's worth flagging the fact that, it is an iterative process and you're always trying to debate issues.
Always.
Yeah. So maybe a question, slightly different question on the ones we looked at. A question around maybe for students, advice for students from your perspective, both from your experience in business and then more laterally in politics. In terms of what advice for the third level students who are in the room today, what would you say about maybe, first of all, learning about maybe the interface of politics and economics, and then secondly, in terms of maybe the kind of skills that they could maybe think to develop to succeed in the world of either business or politics?
So if I deal with the intersection between politics and economics first, the first thing is I'd make a kind of an impassioned case that for those who are developing expertise and learning in the academic community and in our humanities, to also make the effort to try to apply that in the policy making sphere as well, and understand the political challenges and needs and obligations that policymakers have as well. And then likewise, the other way around, that for those of us then that are in the policy-making community, to be reaching in to our academic community and our humanities and to be engaging with them regularly as well, to try to explain the work that we are doing. And then for those who are thinking about kind of careers in business or maybe politics beyond this, for those who are thinking about a life in politics, the first thing I'd say to them is, shouldn't be your career. Do other things first. It's so important. If you are interested in a policy making, but politically, do lots of other things before you begin that, because you have to have a hinterland and an appreciation of life outside politics if you want to be in politics. If you're interested in policy making, but not politically, our civil service is a great place to work in. I mean, I have had the privilege of, working in other employers before this. And the Irish civil service is a really good employer with really good people working in it that can give you a great career.
Yeah.
And that and the commission, and maybe a combination of both, can give a great career to people who are interested in public service. And have the kind of learning that you, Cian, and your colleagues will be imparting to your students. And then beyond that, then for business life and that, entrepreneurship, working for good companies is great fun and hugely rewarding. And and what I would be doing that may sound inappropriate or maybe even poignant, given the limitations that I know so many of your students have at the moment, is when we can get back to campus life and when we can get back to being with each other physically, that to make sure your education is as broad as possible, that you're getting the best of what Cian and his colleagues have to offer you, but be in societies, be in sports, be in charities, be in politics, do it all, because that rounded education is so important. And like, I had all kinds of ups and downs in my academic career that I won't go into too much, because this is an open event, and no doubt lead to queries that will probably come in now to the press office. But I did I sampled. As a student, participated in our societies and participated in all they had to offer, and then did my best in academic life as well. And it's that rounded thing that's really important then for later in life, particularly in an atmosphere that has so much to offer, as you all do in Galway. It's such a rich atmosphere.
Okay, I have we've about 5 minutes left, so I might ask you a hard question now, because I guess
these haven't been hard.
These are the easy ones. No, I was going to say that obviously over the next number of years, as we exit the pandemic, and we assume that obviously the emergency supports are going to be removed, there's obviously going to be a legacy of increased debt. So I suppose the question would be, in terms of making difficult decisions, I'll ask this in two parts. What has been the most difficult decision you've had to make to date as minister? And then secondly, do you anticipate making yourself very unpopular over the next couple of, let's assume you're in situ for the next couple of years, and you have to make decisions around increasing debt or trying to narrow the deficit? How do you think you're going to plan to do that? So that's a nice, easy one.
My God, the most difficult decision as Minister for Finance. So this probably, I'll quickly list three, because I can't figure out which is the hardest one. The first one would be some of the challenges and decisions that I had to make in the last government when we were facing into a Garda strike. The second one is some of the decisions that we were making towards the end of 2019 in that phase of Brexit, which was a really challenging test. And then the third one would be the group of decisions that I made across March and April of last year, when we were furiously trying to design the employment wage subsidy scheme, trying to figure out how we would execute it, what the level of payment would be. Same for the pandemic unemployment payment, trying to figure out all of that. And myself and the now Taoiseach, and then my colleague Regina Doherty, we had a whole set of meetings with all of our officials when we were really trying to figure out all of this. And as you said, Cian, a moment ago, it was really iterative. And no policymaker in Ireland, or indeed across the world, had stable information regarding how things were going to play out. And we were so aware, the three of us, and I was deeply aware, that we were making decisions that were going to have a profound effect on people's living standards and their lives, but on our country as well. And you may recall at one point, I was indicating to the country that we could have had deficits of 26 to 30 billion euro. No, we didn't come near that in the end, but they were really difficult sets of decisions. And in relation to making myself unpopular in the future, so the assumption would be there, I guess, that I've ever had a degree of popularity, and I'm not sure I have. And as Minister for Finance, I think your need is to be kind of making the case for what you are doing, and to be able to command a majority of public support for it. And I'm going to have to continue to do it. But to maybe offer a degree of assurance on it, because of how we did go into this crisis, and then because of how much more complete the architecture is of the euro now versus where we were a decade ago, and the role of the ECB, like the set of decisions I believe we're going to face into are not equivalent to where we were a decade ago. I hope that will help me make the case then for what we'll need to do in the future.
Yeah, I'm conscious now we're almost at the end. I might, again, just for the last minute or two, take on a slightly different tack, which is over the last week, obviously, we've seen the proposals for a European Super League in football come and go in record time, and it's possibly the most spectacular failure at a European level that I've seen in a long time. I know you're a fan of a certain club in England that's a rival of mine apparently, and just in terms of maybe just, is it a case study just in more general terms about a good example of something that was conceived maybe with the wrong expectations of how it's going to transpire? So maybe the lessons that could be learned both from the point of view of, I suppose, the game itself, but more generally about organization, strategy, planning, and if something similar happened at a political level, it would obviously be disastrous. But any comment on that before we finish?
Yeah, I was appalled by it. I am a lifelong, ever-suffering supporter of Tottenham Hotspur.
For your sins, yeah.
All my sins. Are you
I'm an
Chelsea or Arsenal? Are you?
I'm an Arsenal fan, yes.
Arsenal fan, okay. Which both of us are suffering at the moment.
Exactly.
You won the FA Cup last year, and you're still in the Europa League, which is more than we are at the moment. It was a case study of what happens when ownership becomes detached from the value that countries and communities place on something. It's a case study of it. But it was also a case study of how community and allegiance can reassert itself to change the way something is going. Thankfully, it's not going ahead, but I do suspect it is a pretext to the financial challenges now of clubs becoming more apparent as we move out of a pandemic era. I think the next phase of the story that awaits to be told is maybe how this could have been driven by, this is being driven by financial need. I'm delighted it's not happening. I began Monday. Wasn't it Sunday night it all broke in? Discussed it with Spurs. Appalled that this was happening, that we are involved in it. Saying to myself, I'm now going to support Leicester. I'm not going to let this happen. But sure, of course, by last night, I was constantly looking at whether they were going to beat Southampton or not. So isn't this the light? Isn't this the play? Isn't this the challenge of a sports supporter?
I thought it was an interesting one, that in the sense that the lessons, even for a political party as well, that maybe if a party gets detached from its supporters, that something similar, I suppose, could befall them.
And governments and political projects. But of course, I'd flip it on its head and say that this is also a lesson that the European Union is so aware of, which is why it does at times, most of the time, move so slowly, because it's always aware that as a political project, it always has to make the case for consent. And this is why actually the EU is a remarkable demonstration of political resilience. If you look at how few decisions in the EU are ever reversed, if you look at how the architecture of the EU is always built upon, as opposed to unraveled, with the exception of Brexit. But again, the reaction of the EU to Brexit since 2016 is a remarkable story of it. But then again, and as you said yourself, for governments and for political parties and for political order, it's a remarkable demonstration of it. But look, when it goes back to, just to bring it back to soccer, despite how I felt about it all on Sunday night, I'll still be watching Spurs play Man City on Sunday afternoon and hoping we win 5-0.
Yeah, well, I won't.
You feel the same, Cian.
I'll feel the same. Yeah, exactly. So, thanks very much. So I'd like to thank everybody. There was loads of questions came in, and obviously I was trying my best to synthesize them and ask as many questions as we could. You can certainly appreciate we could easily have gone on for another hour, but as the minister said at the very beginning, he now has to rush across. almost Mission Impossible style, maybe more than 30 seconds to spare to get to the Dáil to vote through the next stage of the emergency support. So I'd like to thank the Minister, the Department. I'd also like to thank our President, our Dean, and most particularly Angela and Courtney in our Whittaker Institute, and to thank Lisa on the Department of Finance side for putting together this presentation. As the Minister said at the very beginning, in an ideal world, obviously we'd like to welcome back to Galway, and obviously that's something we are all looking forward to over the next year or so as we exit this situation. So again, I'd like to thank you, Minister, for taking the time, and wish you well.
Thank you all, and best of luck to all of you in your studies and works, and to the students in particular. You know, we're all aware of what this has meant for you, and we're doing all we can to get you back to what you deserve.
Thanks.